Once upon a time, in the late 2010s and early 2020s, European elites appeared to have found a new raison d'etre. D'etre? Raison d'etre. I don't speak French. This was the continent that would lead the world economy into a new green economy.
The main point of this roadmap must be climate change. Indeed, the youth throughout Europe have been expressing this message. Our citizens also expressed the importance of climate change for them in the elections, and this has been the case for a number of years.
The European Green Deal is for the climate, but it's also for the people. And there's a huge transition ahead of us, and we have to invest in it to leave nobody behind.
To unlock that potential and protect our planet for future generations, I can announce today Labour's climate investment pledge. An additional £28 billion of capital investment in our country's green transition for each and every year of this decade.
My apologies. That wasn't the smoothest intro I've ever done, but that was Macron, von der Leyen and Rachel Reeves, all in the years between 2019 and 2021, saying how their big priority was going to be to invest tons and tons of money in a new green economy. Well, how times change. Of course, you'll know that pledge by Labour to invest £28 billion a year was dropped 3 years later. The EU's Green Deal is itself nowhere near reaching its €1 trillion investment goal, which is what von der Leyen had set out for it. And by June this year, campaigners warned that a rollback on EU environmental policy was gaining momentum. So, climate has taken a back seat in terms of European governance. But what has replaced it?
We are in an era of rearmament. And Europe is ready to massively boost its defense spending.
While we had planned to double the budget by 2030, we will double it by 2027. To this end, an update of the military programming law will be presented in autumn that will foresee the effort we will undertake until 2027 under my responsibility, and I am appealing to the responsibility of the nation.
I know that this House will endorse the principle of winning peace through strength. So starting today, I can announce this government will begin the biggest sustained increase in defence spending since the end of the Cold War.
Yes, we're rearming, baby. Of course, climate change isn't going anywhere. And in fact, the world seems to be heating up faster than scientists expected back in the heady days of 2019 and 2021. But events got in the way. There was a war in Ukraine, some modest electoral setbacks, especially in elections to the European Parliament, and Trump was returned to the White House. And now, investments in windmills and batteries are taking a backseat to armoured vehicles and precision munitions. Did it really have to be this way? A new research group has been set up to argue that it didn't and still doesn't need to. The Transition Security Project is tasked with investigating military-industrial complexes as economic, climate and geopolitical threats. And when I caught up earlier with the group's co-director, Ken Rogley, and asked him what the project will do.
So the new project, Transition Security Project, is founded at a moment when military spending is at an all-time high. In Europe, most NATO countries have now committed to a completely arbitrary military spending target that commits them to basically doubling their military budgets over the next decade. And that includes here in the UK. We know at Transition Security Project that comes with massive economic, climate and geopolitical costs. We want to investigate these costs further. We want to shape the media narrative to ensure that they're properly understood. And we want to support organising, whether that's in trade unions or in national politics, to challenge this militarization of our societies.
Just to clarify, is military spending really at an all-time high? I suppose that my mental model is that it was very high during the Cold War, and the Cold War ended and it fell to much lower levels, and then Russia invaded Ukraine and now it's gone back up again. But my mental model didn't have it as at all-time highs, but I might be mistaken. If you could talk about that a bit more.
100%. So I think, as far as I know, the data that we have goes back to the Second World War, which is SIPRI, a Stockholm Institute, basically, that collates it internationally. I think what you just said, though, captures one of the key narratives that we're here to kind of unpick and to challenge. Military spending in the UK, in real terms, is higher now than it was in 1980. kind of one of the key moments of the Cold War. And actually, although it did come down a little bit in real terms in 1990, it soon increased and kind of overtook its Cold War levels during the War on Terror, and it's now at an even higher level. The same story is true in the US, where military spending is much, much higher in real terms than it was in that kind of peak Cold War moment. So really, the kind of idea that we had this peace dividend and we're now kind of returning to that is a bit of a myth. We had a huge period of militarization under the War on Terror, and now things are kind of even more extreme than they were before.
When you say real terms, you're talking about the absolute amount we're spending on the military, taking into account inflation. Another way of looking at it, isn't it, is a proportion of GDP. So as a proportion of GDP, I presume military spending's not at an all-time high, but you tell me.
Yes, exactly. So proportion of GDP in the UK, it's definitely come down since the Cold War. But the reason that they use the proportion of GDP figures, the reason NATO uses that, is because it obscures the actual amount that you spend. So if you look at the latest commitment, European governments have signed up to spending 5% of their GDP on what they call military and associated investments. So 3.5% on their militaries, an additional 1.5% on these as yet undefined security-related investments. That is a doubling of where lots of them are at now. In the UK context, if you look at GDP forecasts, if you look at SIPRI's analysis of this, it's looking like £75 billion extra per year by 2035. This is a massive, massive amount of money in the current economic context of the UK. And to be honest, the government don't really have a plan of where they're going to get that money from, what that spending is going to consist of. They've just signed up to this GDP figure because the GDP figure is set as a kind of geopolitical posture by NATO rather than anything to do with military need, security need, or the kind of economic necessities of the time that they commit to it.
Your argument is that there's a strong sort of intersection between militarization and climate change. I suppose there's two mechanisms, isn't there? So sort of one, that the investments we make in the military, we could instead make in mitigating climate change, a sort of opportunity cost. And the other is the direct emissions that come from the military. I suppose, is that in the production of military equipment or that equipment being used when fighting wars? I suppose, talk to me about the relationship as you understand it between militarization and climate change.
So this is an often hidden relationship, actually, because the Pentagon, and it's well documented, lobbied to get military emissions removed from the Kyoto Protocol in 1997 because they were so concerned that international climate agreements could restrict their operations. And that's because militaries are a huge and hidden source of emissions. Globally, they represent about 5.5% of all greenhouse gas emissions. So that's double civilian aviation and civilian shipping combined. And really, the source of those emissions is partly in production, the production of weapons that we're now going to see at a massive scale in Europe, in the UK, and obviously more and more in the United States, but also, and I would say primarily, in the operation. So you think of the US military, you think of 750 bases across the world, the kind of global behemoth. But often people talk about the UK military as if it's this kind of little minnow that's been gutted over the last few years and is now kind of returning to strength. It's not the case at all. It's also got these bases everywhere across the world. It's obviously well-equipped interventions, as we saw, well-equipped to do horrific military interventions overseas, as we saw in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and elsewhere. So all of those interventions, all of that kind of overseas infrastructure has a big emissions effect. You know, you're moving people, you're moving weapons all across the world. So, for instance, if you look at the emissions from the genocide in Gaza, which for me is not really an important effect of a genocide, but it tells you a lot about how militaries actually work. And the emissions come from the Israeli fighter jets. They come from the massive movement of US weapons, of European weapons to Israel. That's where the kind of the predominant source of these emissions comes from.
And this turn to militarism, or this turn to rearmament, let's say, because it's very clear that there was a moment, I suppose, in the early 2020s when it seemed like sort of the state project of the EU, even Britain, in America under Joe Biden, was sort of, let's invest in a new green economy. That was sort of very much in vogue. That's very much been put on the back foot, and people are now saying, okay, that's going to have to wait. Defense comes first. What's your analysis of why that decision has been made? Is it a mistake on the part of elites? They think that Russia is more threatening than you believe Russia is. Do you think this is the military-industrial complex or an opportunity and sort of took advantage of it? What's your analysis of why that shift happened?
So I think there's a combination of those factors, but really the kind of way that I would distill it is that what they're not saying is defense comes first. What they're actually saying is that geopolitics comes first. And really this is an attempt of the US in its rivalry with China to lean on the kind of remaining strategic advantage that it has. You know, it's not going to supersede China as a green industrial powerhouse. It's not going to defeat China as a kind of economic productive engine. What it does have is obviously financial strength with the dollar, but it has military strength. So it's leaning into its military strength. And the reason that we're seeing this in Europe is because it's being demanded by the US as a kind of sign of loyalty to NATO and to the White House. So as I kind of explained earlier, that new spending target, it comes directly from the US. It's not based on any assessment of how many weapons do we need, what do our militaries need for kind of national or regional defense. It is purely the exact amount that the Pentagon spends as a percent of GDP. So it's 3.5% on militaries. That's what the Pentagon spends. That's what the Europeans have been forced to sign up for. So really from a kind of European perspective, what they've gone for kind of in that Cold War, in that great power rivalry, is to sign up with their kind of full loyalty and allegiance to the US, to say, you know, we don't want to lose this partnership. We're going to sacrifice those green investments. We're going to sacrifice social spending. What we believe is most important is kind of demonstrating our allegiance to the White House.
And I suppose when it comes to Ukraine, because for whatever reason, that does seem to have been part of the turning point, especially when it comes to European rearmament, maybe less so when it comes to the United States. But there was an analysis that the European or Western Europe or the EU powers got a bit caught off guard, and that actually they weren't particularly well equipped to provide Ukraine with what it needed to defend itself, particularly in terms of the production of military equipment and artillery and the like. So Russia, I mean, basically proved to be more capable at that than the rest of Europe. Was there a problem there? Do you think that there was a sense in which the Europeans got caught off guard, or do you just think that's sort of the wrong track to be going down? What's your take on that?
So actually, if you look at the spending, it becomes very clear that they weren't caught off guard, because it's really the decade between 2014 and 2024 that you see this massive surge in European military spending. It didn't start with the land invasion of Ukraine. It started a long time before then. And basically what you see is that European NATO countries, actually specifically in Central and Western Europe, so not Eastern European countries that might have that kind of greater proximity to Russia and kind of feel the effects of that rivalry more, their spending has doubled over that decade between 2014 and 2024, even in Central and Western Europe. It's not just doubled, they've also doubled their arms imports from the US. So kind of across that whole period, they were still spending huge amounts of money on their militaries. They were importing loads of weapons. It didn't stave off the invasion of Ukraine and that conflict. And obviously that conflict has come with massive human cost as well. It's absolutely devastating, and solutions do need to be found to it. But I think the real idea here is not that kind of Europeans have started rearming as of 2022 in response to that invasion. It's a process that's been going on for a longer time. And if you look at the roots of it, obviously there are kind of moments of Russian expansion that were happening, but really there was also a lot of pressure starting from the Obama era White House, basically on the Europeans to up their military spending. As I say, in that kind of strategic battle that we have going on between the US and China, the US wants to kind of showcase both its own military power and to increase the military power of its allies. So it's been pressuring European governments from that moment in 2014 until now, where you get those leaked messages from White House officials saying that Europeans should pay for the US to bomb Yemen, for instance. I mean, the UK was bombing Yemen for a year over the last year just to show its support to the US and to Israel.
And I mean, NATO is partly back on the agenda on the left. Zach Polanski from the Greens has said sort of he has a long-term ambition to leave NATO. He said there'd need to be some kind of independent allied European force beforehand. Zara Sultana, I suppose, has outflanked him and said that she thinks it should be a red line that the UK immediately leaves NATO. Is that the kind of analysis you would have? Do you think that the UK would need to immediately leave NATO to reduce military spending, or could we just say to the US, yeah, we'll stay in NATO as long as you'll have us, but we're not spending whatever it is, 5% of GDP on the military?
Well, I think it depends how you'd want it to play out politically. You could certainly do the latter. I mean, Spain, for instance, resisted the military spending target. They asked for the climate crisis to be treated as a security threat. And they actually used their military not as a kind of military force in some context, but they have divisions that are focused entirely on disaster relief and aren't also fighting forces at the same time. So there are ways that kind of spending target can be either resisted or be reshaped. I mean, the UK has taken the most extreme strategy possible in trying to not just be the kind of loyal figure to the US and Europe, but trying to lead the process of European rearmament along with France and Germany. So I think that there's a kind of variety of options on the table for Zara and for Zach to resist that. I would say, though, that I think for me, there's a kind of a way that they can be caught in the trap here on questions like, should we abolish Trident or should we leave NATO? Those aren't the political choices that they would be making. Obviously, both of them are very far from electoral power at the moment. So the idea to say kind of day one in government feels a bit ridiculous anyway. But say it was day one in government, those aren't the choices that they're going to be making. I think the choice that they should be making is a much more strategic one, which is pursuing a strategy of non-alignment from the US, de-aligning ourselves from the US empire, closing overseas bases like on Cyprus, which the US uses to surveil Gaza and move military material to Israel, close our base on Diego Garcia, which was potentially going to have been used as a launching pad to bomb Iran, to reduce military spending and to look at a defense strategy that is actually about national defense and rather than about this kind of loyalty to the US. So to come up with a new spending target it would inevitably be lower, but it's thinking about our military as a defensive force and using the rest of the spending that we have there as a means of ensuring the everyday security of our citizens, whether that's security in climate crisis, but also healthcare, housing, schools, hospitals, the key elements of our everyday lives that we need security in. That's how I would be thinking about it, rather than kind of these kind of quite strange questions in some ways, or at least questions that oversimplify the matter to, do you leave NATO or do you abolish Trident on day one?
That was Kem Rogley, co-director of Transition Security Project, speaking to me earlier today. You can find their work at transitionsecurity.org. And that's it for us today. My thank you to Dalia Gabriel. And we'll be back tomorrow at 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.